Were there atheists when Jesus walked the streets of Galilee? The short answer will surprise you. Yes, but not in the neat, modern way most of us mean when we say atheist. To answer that question properly, we have to step back from our 21st century assumptions about religion as private belief, and into a world where religion was first and foremost a public practice, a civic glue, and a legal expectation. Once we do that, the label atheos, literally without gods, reveals itself as a flexible accusation that could mean at least three very different things. In this first part, we'll unpack the first two senses and set the scene for the third. Start by fixing a crucial corrective. In the ancient Mediterranean, religion was not primarily an inner creed. People measured piety by rituals performed, oaths kept, offerings made, funerary rites observed, and by the visible signs that the gods continued to favor the city or the household. To be religious was to participate in communal rites that bound family and polis. To be irreverent or impious, the Greek concept atheia, was to offend those rituals, and by extension, to risk the community's well-being. That emphasis on practice reshapes how we read charges of atheos. Often, the accusation did not intend to describe a private metaphysical conviction. It designated someone who, through words or actions, stood outside the web of ritual obligations that sustained a city's relationship with its gods. Think of it this way. In that world, a person could verbally affirm the gods, but somehow be treated as without gods because their behavior suggested the gods had withdrawn their favor. The phrase abandoned by the gods crops up in ancient ethical and legal discourse precisely to mark that condition. The gods are not conceptual entities at a distance. They are an active force whose approval is signaled or withdrawn by success, fertility, good harvests, and crucially, by whether a person honored the established rites. This first sense of atheos we can call impiety. The idea that someone had violated the necessary forms of religious life so grievously that either the gods had forsaken them or society treated them as if they had never had the gods at all. In this register, atheos was a social and religious diagnosis. It could follow sacrilege, broken oaths, refusal to perform rites, or behavior that made the gods' favor appear to have left a person or community. We see this in legal cases and public controversies from Athens to Rome. The trial of Socrates is the famous example. He stood in an Athenian courtroom charged with atheia, impiety, and with corrupting the youth. Contemporary and later sources frame the accusation in familiar terms. Socrates questioned received wisdom, encouraged young citizens to test the stories of the gods, and introduced novel spiritual ideas.
Whether he intended an outright denial of gods is debated. The charge placed him, legally and symbolically, outside the religious world most Athenians trusted. The question then was not only philosophical, it was civic. The city felt endangered, or claimed to feel endangered, by a man whose speech undermined the shared rituals and beliefs that secured the polis's well-being. Socrates' case makes clear two things. First, impiety could be understood as a public harm. Second, atheos in this sense functioned as shorthand for social dislocation, a person whose conduct was thought to have angered or driven away the gods. Other figures received harsher treatment for similar reasons. Anaxagoras, for instance, reportedly faced hostility for suggesting naturalistic explanations that displaced mythic accounts of divine activity. Diagoras of Melos earned a wider reputation as a godless man and was said to have been driven into exile. The Roman world likewise had its examples. Philosophers and outspoken critics occasionally attracted legal charges of impiety or were targeted by mob violence. In these moments, to be without gods meant to be suspected of having cut the ritual cord that bound citizens to their city's protection. Why did ancients react so strongly? Because they believed the gods' favor, expressed through pax deorum, the peace of the gods, was practical and precarious. If communal rites were neglected, the gods might withdraw protection and calamities could follow: storms, military defeat, famine, plague. The accusation of atheia thus carried not only moral weight but political urgency. To be branded atheos could lead to ostracism, prosecution, or worse. It was, in effect, a charge that someone threatened the collective good by violating the practices that guaranteed it. This is why we must resist the temptation to translate atheos simply as atheist in our modern sense. Too often, that translation imports contemporary commitments, that religion is private and that belief equals identity, into an environment that prioritized action and corporate safety. Still, the impiety sense of atheos is only one of the three ancient meanings that matter for our question. There are two more, and each opens a different window on how people in antiquity thought about gods, disbelief, and social order. But before we move to those other senses, it's worth pausing on the lived textures of this first category because it helps us understand how powerful the label could be. Picture an Athenian assembly, the ecclesia, or a Roman forum. The life of the community is articulated through rites and festivals. If some figure refuses an honorific sacrifice or speaks contemptuously of ancestral rites, their action is audible and visible. News travels. The city's elders and magistrates judge whether to ignore the offense, punish it, or expel the offender.
In a small community, a reputation for impiety could follow a person from market to harbor. In larger cities, the charge could mobilize popular anger or illegal machinery. The ancients connected misfortune and human conduct in a way modern secular sensibilities find foreign. But for them, the link was real and consequential. A label of atheia could be a social death sentence. There is another feature to note. The sources that preserve these stories are often hostile or litigating narrators. We mostly encounter reports about impious figures through aggressive opponents, prosecutors, or later commentators who want to explain a trial or a conviction. That means the category of impiety is itself a rhetorical tool. One could weaponize atheos to delegitimize an adversary's politics or philosophy. Socrates' prosecutors framed him as a danger to public religion and thereby to the city's stability. Later writers used the same framework to explain the ostracism or downfall of other provocative thinkers. So impiety is a lived situation, but also a rhetorical charge that could be amplified by political interests. Now, the early Christian story intersects with this first sense in intriguing ways. When Christians refused to offer incense to the emperor or to take part in civic cults, pagan observers sometimes described them as atheos, godless, not because Christians denied the existence of divinity, but because they rejected the city's apparatus for honoring its gods. From a pagan standpoint, Christians were outsiders who endangered the civic order. From a Christian standpoint, the accusation was absurd. They worshipped a true God and considered the statues and ceremonies of the empire to be idolatrous. These mutual accusations made the label atheos a site of clash rather than mere description. At this point, stop and consider a practical aside. If this kind of historical nuance intrigues you and you enjoy historical theological deep dives that resist easy answers, subscribe. There's more to come where that came from. Now let's move to the second sense of atheos, and it will feel like switching rooms in an old building, from courtroom to lecture hall. The second meaning is intellectual skepticism about God's existence or about the traditional stories that surrounded them. Here the atheos tag becomes about ideas, not ritual. In Greek philosophical circles, especially among the more skeptical or naturalistic thinkers, we find arguments that either question the god's moral likeness to humans, denied providential intervention, or suggested that gods were human constructions. These positions are philosophical, often fragmentary, and sometimes elitist, located in schools and salons rather than in the marketplace, but they matter because they show a genuine spectrum of doubt and critique well before the modern period. Protagoras is a key early figure. He is often associated with a posture that refused to commit to claims about the gods' existence because knowledge about them was, in his view, beyond human certainty. The famous line attributed to him, that concerning the gods we have no certain knowledge, marks an epistemological modesty that stops short of downright belief denial. Protagoras' stance is agnostic in tone. It withholds assent because the evidence is insufficient. For the ancient world that tended to assume visible proof of divine favor, such a claim was explosive. Xenophanes offers a different but related critique. He attacked the crude anthropomorphism of popular religion, the idea that gods simply looked and acted like superpowered humans with human vices and virtues. Xenophanes argued instead for a more abstract conception of divinity, a critique that delegitimized many mythic portraits of the gods. His insistence that gods are not like mortals undermined the authority of story-based reverence and opened space for thinking religion in non-anthropomorphic terms. In one stroke, mythic story as the primary vehicle of divinity was called into question. Then there are the voices who explain religion as a human invention. A fragmentary skeptical tradition suggests that gods were projected into being to organize society, to enforce norms, and to control behavior. That is a social theory of religion. Gods are useful fictions. Evameris, a later Hellenistic writer, made this idea systematic. Evamerism, named after him, proposed that many gods originated as extraordinary humans who were later deified by grateful or myth-making successors. The claim is not simply denial, but historical reduction. Gods began as great men and were mythologized over time. For readers who took Evameris seriously, the scale of a god was reducible to the scale of politics and memory. Divine status, in effect, was awarded to exceptional human figures. Epicurus offers another twist that complicates how we think about atheism in antiquity. Epicureanism does not deny the existence of gods outright. Instead, it posits gods as perfect, but completely uninterested in human affairs. According to Epicurean cosmology, gods exist in a kind of blessed solitude and do not concern themselves with human justice, reward, or punishment. That theological move relieves believers of fear of divine retribution, and in practice could make the gods functionally irrelevant to ethics and civic life. Some contemporaries saw Epicureanism as countable to atheism because it denied divine providence even while conceding divine existence. We should add a note of caution. Much of what we know about these skeptical tendencies comes to us through hostile intermediaries. Plato, Aristotle, and later Christian apologists often frame their accounts in order to rebut or delegitimize these thinkers. That means we must read the testimonies with care and humility.
Still, the cumulative picture is clear enough to say that a number of ancient thinkers entertained doubts about the god's nature, skeptical claims about human knowledge of the divine, and historical explanations that deflated mythical accounts. In short, intellectual positions existed that questioned the traditionalist religious narrative. A few particular examples deserve brief attention because they illustrate how diverse these skeptical positions could be. Diagoras of Melos earned a reputation as an outspoken critic of the gods and was labeled by some later sources as the atheist. The precise content of his charges is fragmentary, but the label stuck. He was remembered as someone who denied or ridiculed the gods. Anaxagoras, who thought natural processes explained celestial phenomena, found himself in trouble for the apparent implications of his cosmology. If the sun and moon are natural bodies rather than divine beings, then the old stories about gods are undermined. Some were punished or ostracized for such views not simply for abstract reasoning, but because those views threatened the community's rituals and sense of order. Cicero, writing in the Roman era, surveys the array of philosophical positions about the gods with a kind of puzzled amusement. Some say gods have moral qualities, some say they are indifferent, and others treat them as figments of human convention. His survey illustrates how contested the idea of divine providence had become among the educated classes. To Cicero's lay readers, these debates could look dangerously subversive. To philosophers, they were serious arguments about epistemology and metaphysics. There is also a fragmentary line of skeptical thought that explicitly treats the gods as inventions designed to regulate people. This is the line that anticipates later sociological theories of religion. Gods serve social functions. The claim here is not a straightforward metaphysical denial, but a sociological explanation. Gods arise to regulate behavior and maintain order. For those inside the city who depended on gods for moral and social cohesion, such explanations were politically consequential. Even if the skeptical argument is purely explanatory, its effect in public life could be corrosive. If gods are merely social tools, why obey them? Why perform sacrifices? Philosophical skepticism in antiquity therefore ranges from agnostic withholding of judgment, Protagoras, to critique of anthropomorphous gods, Xenophanes, to historical reductionism, Evameris, to functionalist accounts of religion, to theological reconfigurations that make gods irrelevant to human affairs, Epicurus. These are not identical to modern secularism, but they show that reasoned non-theistic or non-providential positions were present in the intellectual world of the first centuries BCE and CE.
That observation yields a key point for our title question. A form of atheism existed among certain thinkers in the time around Jesus, but it is an elite, philosophical phenomenon rather than a mass social movement. Our surviving evidence is weighted toward literate, philosophically engaged circles. The popular masses, farmers, craftsmen, small traders, left far fewer textual traces. So while philosophers who questioned the gods were certainly present,
The question of how widespread such views were among ordinary people is, and must remain, unknown. Still, the existence of these thinkers complicates a tidy story in which ancient societies were uniformly devout and unreflected. The ancient intellectual landscape contained genuine diversity. Some insisted on traditional piety, others reimagined divinity, and others cast gods as human artifacts. These debates mattered because they intersected with politics, education, and legal practice. A philosopher could teach ideas in a private setting that later became hotly public after a scandal, a play, or a prosecution. The charges of acebeia we discussed earlier were sometimes the legal expressions of philosophical conflict. When ideas threatened civic practice, the city translated intellectual disagreement into charges of impiety. At this point, we see both faces of antiquity's atheos. One face is about social ritual and communal bombs, the impious man accused of driving away the gods. The other face is about ideas and knowledge, the thinker who argued that gods are either unknowable, non-anthropomorphic, or unnecessary. Both faces matter for understanding whether atheists existed when Jesus walked the streets of Galilee. But there is a third face, and this is where the story becomes politically and emotionally sharp: the labeling of entire groups, especially early Christians, as atheoi because they refused civic cults. That third sense is where accusations of betrayal, sedition, and civic danger converge, and it brings us back to the Roman realities of imperial cult and communal security. Before we step into that final category, it's worth circling back to one delicate point. Modern readers sometimes want to project modern secular identities backward. If a philosopher argued that gods were inventions, then he must have been a proto-atheist. That leap is too quick. Ancient critics of popular religion often remained theists in some sense, or redeployed theology onto new forms. And even those who denied God's providence could still inhabit a world saturated by ritual expectation. Labels are slippery. When ancient opponents called a philosopher atheos, they were not always offering a precise metaphysical description, so much as drawing a border. This person is not one of us. His views endanger communal life. That rhetorical function is crucial to keep in mind.
We have now traced two of the three senses of atheos that matter for our central question: the social ritual sense, impiety, acebeia, and the intellectual philosophical sense, skepticism, agnosticism, euhemerism, and non-providential theology. Both imply that something worthy of the modern label atheistic can indeed be found in the ancient world, but each also makes clear important differences with contemporary secularism. The third sense, civic non-participation as political indictment, is where Christians find themselves accused of being godless, not because they denied divinity, but because they refused to honor the city's gods. That intersection of religion and law is where many early Christian stories of trial and martyrdom become intelligible. The next part will walk into the Roman civic arena. We'll examine Pax Deorum and the imperial cult, look closely at cases where Christians were branded atheoi, including Polycarp and Justin Martyr, and show how the label atheos functioned as a political instrument. We'll also bring Cicero and Epicurus back into the frame to see how philosophers and politicians understood these conflicts. For now, hold the image of the two rooms: the courtroom where ritual violations are judged, and the lecture hall where philosophical doubt is debated. Both rooms existed in the same ancient world, and both leave traces that make the answer to our title complicated and, in a sense, shocking. Now step into the Roman agora, the forum, the temples, the altars, and the visible machinery that bound city to deity. Here, the third sense of atheos becomes most politically pointed: atheos as refusal to participate in the city's religious life. This is not a subtle philosophical doubt debated in a private schoolroom. It is a visible civic omission, a family that will not perform ancestral rites, a guild that will not sacrifice at the festival, or a group that refuses to offer incense before the emperor's image. In the Roman imagination, such refusals were not merely eccentric, they were dangerous. They threatened the Pax Deorum, the fragile peace of the gods that Romans imagined as the condition securing the welfare of the state. Pax Deorum, literally the God's peace, is a compact way to grasp why ritual non-participation could look like sedition. The Romans did not separate religion and politics the way moderns often do. To honor the gods was to honor the city. To neglect rites or to scorn public cults was in effect to put the city's fortunes at risk. If the gods could be provoked into anger by civic neglect, then failing to perform publicly sanctioned worship could invite collective punishment: storms, crop failures, military defeats. Against that backdrop, a group that refused civic cults could be treated as a civic menace. Enter the early Christians. From a pagan vantage point, Christians looked like people who had abandoned all the customary points of communal reference.
They refused to sacrifice to household and city gods. They would not kneel before statues, nor would they participate in rites honoring the emperor. To cousins who worshipped the city's gods, Christians were not merely heterodox. They were absent from the rituals that constituted civic loyalty. Pagan polemicists and officials therefore reached for the simplest label at hand, athoi, godless. The charge was shorthand for social suspicion. It was as much about civic cohesion as it was about metaphysical belief. This charge could be highly consequential. In several recorded encounters, Christians were brought before civic authorities on charges that read like political offenses. The accusation of atheism functioned as a legal and social lever. It supplied grounds for interrogation, exclusion, and sometimes punishment. Again, the label operated less as a precise theological diagnosis and more as a political brand. It indicated that these people refused to do what the rest of the city did, and refusal was read as potential rebellion. Two historical figures illuminate how this labeling played out. Polycarp of Smyrna stands as a vivid microscene. When Polycarp was accused and led to trial, the exchange, preserved in an early martyr account, turns the moment into a mirror of Roman expectations. The pagan crowd demanded that he cursed Christ and affirmed the gods of the empire. His refusal marked him as outside the civic cult. Contemporary narrators record that the accusers called Christians athoi, while the Christians, in turn, used the accusation rhetorically to expose their accusers' idolatry. That reversal, pagans calling Christians godless, Christians calling pagans idolaters, demonstrates the ironies at work. To the pagans, Polycarp was godless because he rejected civic rites. To Polycarp and his fellow believers, the pagans were irreligious for worshipping carved images. The clash was not merely theological, but juridical and symbolic. Justin Martyr makes the same pattern clearer in a different register. Justin addressed formal defenses of Christians to imperial figures, explaining that Christians could not in good conscience perform civic sacrifices because they worshipped the one true God. Yet pagans continued to brand them as atheists, precisely because Christians refused to invest religious legitimacy in the empire's ceremonies. Justin's apologetic strategy was to show that Christians were in fact religious, devout to a higher conception of God, even as they rejected the city system. His defense reveals both the practical stakes of the charge and the Christian attempt to reframe it. The label athoi could be used to delegitimize a group politically, while the group itself insisted on an alternative religious fidelity. These moments show how flexible the accusation could be.
It could mean impious in the sense of ritual violations. It could mean a philosophical skeptic in elite debates. And in the Roman civic context, it could mean refuser of the sacred duties that bind us. The same word, atheos, could be hurled as a polemical weapon, deployed as a legal rationale, or used descriptively by astute observers. It is important to emphasize how these different senses overlapped and reinforced one another. A philosopher whose public teachings undermined ritual belief could end up charged with asabiya, impiety, because his ideas had civic consequences. A community that practiced a different form of worship could be branded atheist because it refused civic rights. In short, ancient accusations were rarely confined to precise metaphysical debates. They were social instruments shaped by law, custom, and fear. How did Roman officials think about these dangers? Cicero's writings give us a useful glimpse. He surveys the range of philosophical opinions about the gods and treats the subject with a kind of civic unease. To Cicero and others, public order depended on a commonly accepted cosmic framework. Philosophical subtleties mattered less to magistrates than the visible performance of rites that reinforced the temple-state relationship. Even those intellectuals who entertained skeptical hypotheses would sometimes seek to avoid public scandal because civic stability was at stake. That is why prosecutions for asabiya, or riots against perceived impiety, were not uncommon. The state took seriously the communal rituals that maintained pax deorum. Epicurus offers another angle. His school proposed gods who existed but took no interest in human affairs. If taken to its civic conclusion, Epicureanism tended to shrink the gods' practical importance. For those who consider the gods as irrelevant to human justice and providence, civic religious behaviors sometimes became optional curiosities rather than essential duties. Critics saw Epicurean indifference to divine oversight as politically corrosive. If citizens grew confident that the gods would not punish or reward human affairs, why maintain the costly rituals that underwrote civic cohesion? From this point of view, theological positions could have direct political consequences. What then is the answer to our guiding question? Were there atheists when Jesus walked the streets of Galilee?
The balanced, evidence-based reply is yes, but not in the modern uniform sense we tend to assume. The ancient world contained at least 3 distinct ways that someone could be called without gods: as an impious individual thought abandoned by the gods or dangerous to civic life, as a philosophical skeptic who questioned the existence, nature, or providence of the gods, and as a member of a community, most famously early Christians, whose refusal to perform civic rites led neighbors and officials to brand them atheist. Each meaning matters, each is historically attested.
A few corollaries follow from that answer. First, the forms of unbelief or non-participation documented in antiquity are not identical to 21st century secular atheism. Modern atheism often implies a privately held metaphysical conviction, non-belief about gods, usually disentangled from civic rituals. Ancient charges and positions were entangled with public performance, civic identity, and social cohesion. Second, most of our textual evidence for skeptical or atheistic ideas comes from elite literate circles, philosophers, pamphleteers, and court records. The presence of such thinkers proves that critical and non-theistic thought existed, but it does not prove it was widespread among the agrarian, artisan, and trader populations. How common such views were among ordinary people is and must remain unknown, indefinite in the face of the surviving sources. Third, the label atheos could serve rhetorical and political ends. One must be cautious about reading it as a precise technical term for metaphysical unbelief. These distinctions matter for how we read early Christian persecution and how we talk about religion in public life today. The charge of atheism against Christians shows how religious difference could be criminalized when religious practice and civil loyalty refused. To call someone atheos was to call them outside the civic bargain. Understanding that context helps explain why early Christians sometimes faced hostility far greater than their numbers might predict. They refused not only a cult, but also a civic practice tightly woven into empire and identity. There is a second lesson for contemporary conversation. Too often modern debates about belief and unbelief assume a single taxonomy that treats atheist as equivalent across time. When we transplant the modern definition back onto antiquity, we risk erasing the political, social, and ritual dimensions that made ancient religion what it was. Recognizing the multivalent sense of atheos helps us appreciate the complexity of past lives and debates. Ancient accusations tell us as much about the accuser's fears as they do about the accused. Finally, there is a more humble methodological insight. Historical categories, the labels people used, do not always map cleanly onto our categories. Words like atheos inhabited a different semantic field, and we must allow that field to shape our reading of ancient events. That is the shocking truth promised at the outset. Yes, non-theistic ideas and practices existed in the age of Jesus, but they came in forms shaped by ritual expectations, civic imperatives, and elite philosophical inquiry. The surprise is not merely that people doubted or refused. The surprise is how differently those acts and doubts were understood and policed in a world where religion was public and entwined with law. So where does that leave us when we try to speak across centuries? We should be precise and cautious.
When an ancient source calls someone atheos, ask which sense is in play. Is this a charge of impiety, asabeia, based on breached ritual? Is it a report of philosophical skepticism expressed in an elite salon? Or is it a political label applied to a group that refuses civic rights? Answering those questions lets us move beyond anachronism and opens richer interpretive possibilities. And what about Jesus? The sources do not provide direct evidence that he personally debated systematic atheists as we define them today. That silence does not prove absence, it only reminds us of the limits of the record. Our strongest evidence concerns the intellectual currents and civic pressures of the age. Both skeptical thinkers and ritual refusers inhabited the same historical horizon. They help us see the texture of religious life into which Jesus' movement was born. In closing then, were there atheists during the time of Jesus? The concise verdict must be layered. Yes, ancient forms of atheistic thinking and non-theistic practices existed. Yes, people were labeled atheoi for reasons ranging from ritual violation to philosophical skepticism to political noncompliance. But no, these ancient positions do not map one-to-one onto modern secular atheism, and the prevalence of such views among the general population is unknown. Recognizing these nuances deepens our understanding of the past and sharpens how we speak about belief and dissent today. If this exploration stirred your curiosity, consider watching the next video, where we trace how early Christians defended themselves against charges of atheism and how apologetic strategies reshaped the conversation. And if you want more historical theological deep dives, the playlist link next will take you further into the contested religious worlds of antiquity.
Think finally about how a single word, atheos, could both accuse and reveal. It exposes ancient fears, ancient arguments, and the fragile borderlines that once separated civic belonging from religious conviction.